Welcome to Season 3, Episode 11 of Angela Watson's Truth for Teachers. I'm your host, Angela Watson, and I'm here to speak life, encouragement, and truth into the minds and hearts of educators and get you energized for the week ahead. Today, I'm going to share some thoughts on how I created unnecessary stress and sabotaged my own success as a rookie teacher, and how my thinking has changed over time. Visit truthforteachers.com to get the transcript, links to recommended resources, and to share your thoughts on the show. Now, there's no question that being a new teacher is tremendously stressful. But when I reflect on my teaching practice and how it evolved over the years, I realized that I created a lot of my own stress simply through the way I chose to perceive my work. The mindset that I held towards my students and their parents, as well as how I viewed my role in the classroom, often made an annoying incident feel maddening and a challenging situation feel impossible to overcome. Today, I'll share 4 specific ways I sabotaged my own success as a teacher, as well as how and why my thinking changed since then. The first way that I sabotaged my success was that I mimicked the disciplined style of others, even when it made me uncomfortable. I began my teaching career in a time and place where it was considered the norm to exert power and control over students. Respect was something that was demanded, not earned. Shaming students was acceptable. Getting down in kids' faces and saying things like, "Do you understand me, little boy?" was considered an appropriate way to help children recognize the inherent imbalance of power between teachers and students, so kids would stay in their place, quote unquote. This approach to discipline seemed to work for my students' parents, and it worked for many of my colleagues. So I tried it even though I'd never been trained to interact with students that way, and I hadn't been raised in a community where that was the norm. And I guess on the surface level it worked. I mean, my kids followed the rules and they showed me respect. But my interactions with them made me feel uncomfortable. Deep down, I was embarrassed about how I talked to my students. It didn't fit with who I was as a person. And more importantly, it didn't fit with the kind of people that I wanted my students to be. Now, I delve a lot deeper into this story, and I tell about my breaking point when I realized I had made a huge mistake in my discipline methods. Back in Season 1 of the podcast, if you listen to Season 1, Episode 7, it's called Find and Embrace Your Unique Classroom Management Style. I talk a little bit more about this story. Once I caught a glimpse into the long-term effects of speaking to kids in that way, I no longer wanted to be just like the colleagues that I had once admired. What changed was that I realized I could incorporate some of their teaching strategies and lesson ideas, but I would always need to filter everything that I witnessed through the lens of what works for me and the type of classroom community that I wanted to create for my students. When I reflected on how I ran my classroom and led my students, I gave much more consideration to how those choices made me feel and how they made my students feel. Another way that I sabotaged my own success as a teacher was that I was a control freak and I micromanaged my classroom. In the beginning of my teaching career, I wanted to decide and control everything that happened in the classroom. And this need for control went beyond just creating appropriate procedures and routines. It veered into straight-up micromanagement in many ways. For example, I didn't just teach my students to walk quietly in the hallway. I taught them that their hands needed to be in a specific position. It didn't matter if some students were able to walk appropriately without keeping one hand behind their back and one hand over their lips, making a shh motion. I gave the direction for them to walk in that exact position. And therefore, everyone needed to do it every time we walked together as a class, period. And these little micromanaging tendencies were a result of my natural personality type. I like order. I like consistency. And my love for these things was reinforced every time someone came into my classroom and complimented me on how organized everything was, and how students knew exactly what to do, and how smoothly everything ran. So I truly thought I was doing the right thing. Here's what changed. In retrospect, I think I took too much of the classroom ownership from my students. In fact, I know I did. Over the years, I learned to involve students in making more and more decisions about how our classroom ran. It started with baby steps, like just asking students how they thought the class should walk in the hallways, and creating the norms together. I experimented with giving them some choice. So I said, during this discussion, some of us are saying they like to walk with their hands behind their back, and others like to walk with their hands at their sides. I think either way would be okay, as long as we're meeting the goal of not pushing or not hurting anyone around us. Each time I had conversations like that with the kids, and I gave more ownership to them, I saw how much more comfortable they seemed to be in the classroom, and how they became more self-directed. I also realized that I was a lot happier and a lot less stressed when I stopped taking responsibility for things that the kids could do themselves. Seeing those results made it much easier to give up control and to turn the classroom over to kids. In short, I stopped managing and started leading. A third way that I sabotaged my own success as a teacher was that I took students' behavior personally, and I let kids anger me. One of the things that irritated me most as a new teacher was when I'd look a child in the eyes and give a clear directive, and then as soon as I turned my back, he did the opposite. I remember moments when my blood pressure went so high that my vision actually got blurry. I completely lost the big picture. I just allowed myself to get irrationally angry at things that are just a normal part of working with children. And I would fume silently to myself and just replay the situation over and over again in my mind. And I'd also replay it to any teacher who would listen. I'd say, I saw him break that pencil in half with my own 2 eyes, and he stood right there and lied to my face about it. Can you believe it? Students' behavior was like a personal attack in my mind. I made the rules of the classroom, and so when students chose to break those rules, it was an affront to me as the authority figure. It seemed obvious in my mind that if they weren't doing what I told them to do, they didn't respect me. And the solution was to demand respect through swift consequences. But the more that I talked with other teachers, and the more that I read about other people's experiences in the classroom, the more I realized that I wasn't dealing with anything out of the norm. It turns out kids have always been mischievous. Kids have always pushed the boundaries of whatever guidelines are placed on them by anyone. And realizing this helped me not get quite as angry. I also changed because I just plain wore myself out. Around the 3,762nd time that a child did something that she wasn't supposed to, I was just too tired to get worked up about it again. It no longer felt worth upsetting myself when a child misbehaved, because I was finding myself upset all day long. And I no longer wanted to give a bunch of 8-year-olds control over my sanity. Another catalyst for change was that this was all happening around the time when I had started involving students in creating our class rules and our routines. Slowly, I started to see that their misbehavior wasn't about me anymore, because it was no longer my rule or my classroom. It was ours. And they weren't disrespecting me, they were violating our community norms. So instead of having to take a hard stance every time and uphold my own authority in the face of disrespect, my job became to simply remind the student of the way she or he had agreed to participate in our classroom and get things back on track with the help of all the other students in the class. I was no longer alone against 30 kids and trying to enforce my own rules. I had 29 kids on my side and one child who, in that moment, needed to be brought back into unity and harmony with the rest of the classroom community. A fourth and final way that I sabotaged my success as a teacher was that I was incredibly judgmental towards my students' home environment and their parents. My first teaching job was in a 100% free and reduced lunch school about a mile outside of Washington, D.C. And though I chose to work in high-poverty schools throughout my career, and I always had a heart for serving in those communities, I realized with time that I had a number of blind spots and biases that I really needed to work through. I can't begin to calculate how much time and energy I used to waste complaining about what parents didn't do for their students and how they didn't value education like they should. I upset myself so much by thinking about what parents were quote-unquote supposed to do, despite the fact that my attitude was not doing anything to help foster positive relationships with parents. And I was straight up resentful over the fact that I alone was held accountable for my students' achievement, but I had no control over the things at home that were having a profound impact on the kids' readiness to learn. Here's what changed for me. The more time that I spent getting to know the families I served, the more empathetic I was toward them. I was a lot less angry at Sydney's mom for not returning forms on time when she told me she was pregnant with twins and struggling through nausea to do any kind of basic household tasks. I didn't begrudge Marshawn's mom for buying him $150 sneakers but claiming not to have money for the field trip. Once I spent time with Marshawn at recess and learned that his aunt had surprised him with the shoes so he could be like his big cousins. You see, people always have reasons for making the choices they do and acting the way they do. And the more that I listened, and the more that I looked at the big picture, the more I learned to give families the benefit of the doubt and try to understand them rather than judge them. It was a really welcome mindset shift for me because it made me feel less stressed. Each time I was tempted to get worked up about how a parent was or wasn't raising their child, I'd remember that the choices they were making somehow made sense within the context of their perspective and reality. Trying to frame their decision-making within the context of my own worldview only frustrated me and drained me of the energy that I needed in order to help my students. The best thing I could do for my kids was to try to empathize with their family's struggles and recognize that their decisions made sense within the context of their environment and choose to work with them to fight against the effects of poverty rather than fight against the people living in poverty themselves. Now, you might notice that in all 4 of these examples where I sabotaged my own success as a teacher, there were 2 common themes. First, all change in these examples hinged on me being willing to look at the big picture vision instead of just what was happening in the moment. Every time I got upset, it was because I'd lost sight of my vision for the classroom. I sabotaged my success by emulating other people's discipline styles because I was looking for short-term results instead of thinking about what kind of classroom community and character I wanted to help kids develop. I sabotaged my success by micromanaging my classroom because I hadn't solidified a vision for helping students take ownership of their learning. I sabotaged my success by taking students' misbehavior personally because I got caught up in the heat of the moment instead of looking at the big picture of my job as a role model for students and how to control emotions and act rather than react. And I sabotaged my success by judging parents instead of looking at the big picture of their struggles and the larger issues that were making it difficult for them to make the best choices for their kids. So change came when I was willing to start looking at the big picture and not just getting caught up in what was happening in the moment. The other common thread here is that in none of these cases did change ever happen overnight. I never just flipped a switch and somehow became this laid-back person who was unaffected by students' disrespect and completely non-judgmental. I just had a few moments of clarity, and I took action on those moments. And then I took action on them again, and again, and again. And in between those times of action, I inadvertently took steps backwards and fell into old patterns sometimes. These are hard habits to break. But my overall momentum was in a forward direction, and I was actively trying to make better decisions. Like any journey of self-improvement, changing my mindset was a process that took place over many years and is something that I have to continue to be aware of and implement every day. If you want to learn more about how to make these mindset shifts, check out my book called Awakened: Change Your Mindset to Transform Your Teaching. In this book, I share all kinds of ways that my thinking has changed over time, how I made those changes and rooted out those thought patterns that were not serving me well and replaced them with ways that made me a better teacher. I'm going to leave you with a motivational quote for the week ahead that I call the takeaway truth. And the takeaway truth I want you to remember this week is this. It's a quote from an unknown source that says, "Making mistakes is something everyone does. Learning from them is not." So that we're all going to make mistakes in our teaching careers. Not everyone chooses to reflect and learn on them. That's my challenge to you this week. Think about ways that you're sabotaging your own success as a teacher. Reflect on that. Learn from those mistakes. and start moving yourself in a new direction. Thank you so much for listening. Have a fantastic week. You can do this. And remember, it's not going to be easy. It's going to be worth it. Truth for Teachers is a proud member of the Education Podcast Network. Podcasts for educators, podcasts by educators. For more great podcast recommendations, go to edupodcastnetwork.com. That's edupodcastnetwork.com.